Imagine realizing that the exact same machinery driving your absolute worst panic-inducing nightmare, the one where you wake up covered in sweat, heart hammering against your ribs.
Oh, yeah, we all know that one.
Right, so imagine that machinery is functionally identical to ultimate enlightenment. Like, the difference isn't some miraculous change in the universe. The universe hasn't shifted a single inch.
Not an inch.
The difference is exactly zero. So today, we're basically throwing away the diagnostic X-ray machine.
Which is honestly a terrifying proposition for the human intellect.
Oh, completely.
Because we want the X-ray, right. We want that clean, binary, jagged white line that just points and says, here's the problem, here is the cure, here is the solid reality.
We crave that. We crave the concrete. But, well, welcome back to the deep dive. And I want to acknowledge right at the top, directly to you listening, we know you aren't a beginner.
Definitely not.
If you joined us today, you are a veteran of Madhyamaka philosophy. You have already been in the philosophical trenches with us.
You've survived the heavy lifting of Nāgārjuna's Mūlamadhyamakakārikā. I mean, you've navigated the deconstructions of chapters 25 through 27.
Exactly. We know you know how the engine works. So, we are officially skipping the basic chapter-by-chapter summaries today. We aren't going to relitigate the definitions of the 12 links of dependent origination.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, right. And we aren't going to slowly walk through the four corners of the basic tetralemma either. You already know the map. You know how to deconstruct inherent existence.
You've got the tools.
Right. So today, we were zooming all the way out to look at the ultimate grand synthesis of the text. Our mission for this deep dive is to answer one incredibly vital, almost dangerous question.
Which is?
What exactly is this flux that Nāgārjuna is constantly pointing to? Okay, let's unpack this. Because here is the core paradox that keeps people up at night once they actually grasp the text.
It really does keep people up.
It does. If absolutely everything is empty of inherent existence, I mean, if there is no solid self and no solid universe, what the hell is actually happening when we live, when we suffer, and when we take action in the world?
Yeah, it's the ultimate question.
So today, we are going to dive into the mechanics of this flux. We're going to compare it to the friction within the union of the two truths, to the mind-bending concept of suchness, or reality as it is.
That's a big one.
Huge. And we'll get into the absolutely vital distinction between the maps we compulsively draw and the territory we actually inhabit.
What's fascinating here is that we are entering the most profound and arguably the most perilous layer of the middle way.
Perilous how?
Well, because we are moving completely beyond the intellectual deconstruction of reality. Like, it's one thing to sit in a quiet room and intellectually deduce that the universe lacks inherent essence.
Right. On paper, it makes sense.
Exactly. We've already broken the universe down.
Yeah.
Now, the question is, how do we actually abide in it?
Yeah.
How do we live, breathe, work, and love in this centerless, limitless dance of dependent origination without clinging to it out of total desperation?
But also without rejecting it out of nihilism, right?
Precisely.
Yeah.
That is the tightrope walk. And before we can understand how this flux interacts with truth and reality, we have to fundamentally abandon our normal, everyday, linear view of existence.
Which is hard because we love a linear narrative. We love the domino effect. Like if I push domino A, it hits the domino B.
We really do. The human intellect is just desperate for causality to look like a straight, manageable line of solid objects. When we look at something like the 12 links of dependent origination, or even just our own daily suffering, we instinctively imagine one inherently real thing knocking into another inherently real thing.
Right. We conceptualize it like a clockwork mechanism.
Exactly. We think ignorance is this solid, localized block that falls over and hits craving.
And craving is another solid block.
Right, which then falls over and hits suffering.
We want it to be Newtonian physics applied to our psychology.
That's a great way to put it. But the sources we are looking at today make it explicitly clear that the flux is not a straight line of solid objects.
It's not linear at all.
No, it is not a sequential chain of events moving neatly from past to future. It is a limitless and centerless cycle of conditioning.
Let's pause on that word. Centerless.
Yeah, think about the implications of that. It is a multidimensional network where absolutely everything is constantly, simultaneously conditioning everything else.
Wow.
There is no first domino. There is no original cause hiding at the beginning of time.
Because, I mean, if there were a first domino, that domino would have to be uncaused.
Exactly.
It would have to have inherent existence, which Nāgārjuna has already proven impossible.
Right. So we have this completely centerless web. And the sheer overwhelming complexity of that web is what drives us mad.
Which brings up an incredible metaphor from the source material to help us visualize this madness.
The river.
Yes, the river. It compares the cycle of suffering, Sasura, to standing in the middle of a rushing river. You are standing in these violent, freezing rapids, and you are just terrified by the endless, chaotic flow of the water.
It's overwhelming.
So to survive, you frantically try to grab handfuls of water and freeze them into solid ice cubes.
Right. You're demanding that this fluid, dynamic water become a solid, stackable brick.
Exactly. Your ultimate goal is to build a permanent, safe, unmoving ice house right there in the middle of the raging river.
And of course, you are exhausted doing this. I mean, your hands are freezing, the current keeps washing your little ice cubes away, and we feel like you are constantly drowning.
It's a nightmare.
But here is the critical insight. The suffering isn't caused by the water itself.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the water is just water. The river is just the flux. It is completely neutral.
Okay, so then where's the pain coming from?
The suffering is your exhausting, entirely impossible demand for the flux to be permanent and solid. The friction between the reality of the fluid river and your conceptual demand for a solid house, that friction is asara.
So the river itself is the flux. And if we follow that logic, it brings us to what I consider the most radical, confrontational claim in the entire text.
Here we go.
This is the moment that usually breaks people's brains when they first encounter the deeper layers of this philosophy.
It definitely broke mine the first time.
Nāgārjuna claims that there is not the slightest difference between Sasura, this terrible cycle of suffering, and Nirvata, the ultimate liberation. They are the exact same thing.
Yes, and it's a claim that is wildly misinterpreted all the time.
How so?
Well, people think it means suffering is good or something, but what he means is they are made of the exact same boundless, centerless flux of existence.
Right.
This is where people profoundly misunderstand the concept of enlightenment. They think nirvana means escaping the rushing river, climbing up the riverbank and walking over a hill to find a magical, peaceful, secret second river.
A second river where the water doesn't move and the sun is always shining.
Exactly. A river of pure, unconditioned, static bliss. Like a spa getaway from the universe.
But there is no second river.
None. The ontology of reality doesn't suddenly split into two dimensions just because you meditated enough.
Right.
There is only the flux. Nirvana is simply putting on a pair of non-dual glasses. It is the moment you finally drop your hands.
You stop grabbing the water.
You stop trying to violently freeze the water into ice cubes. You accept the fluidity of the river, you let go of the demand for solidity, and you just learn how to swim.
Okay, but the temperature of the water hasn't changed.
Not a single degree. The speed of the current hasn't stopped. The flux is absolutely identical. The only thing that has changed is your relationship to it. You have ceased the demand for inherent solidity.
Okay, I have to push back here. Hard.
Go for it.
Because this is where the philosophy meets the actual pavement of human existence. If you tell me that the nightmare of my daily commute, or like a toxic, abusive relationship, or an agonizing physical disease, if you're saying that is the exact same flux as enlightenment, doesn't that completely invalidate the visceral pain I feel?
That's the trap.
Like if you were telling me the flux is empty of inherent existence, and it's all just this neutral, centerless web, is my suffering just a fake illusion? Should I just pretend I'm not drowning? Because it certainly doesn't feel fake when the water is in my lungs.
It absolutely shouldn't feel fake because it is functionally intensely real.
Okay, good.
This is the danger of colloquial emptiness talk. When Nāgārjuna says phenomena are empty, he is not saying they are non-existent or fake.
Right.
This is why we have to use the nightmare analogy, because it perfectly validates the relative experience of suffering without granting it absolute inherent reality.
Right. In the intro, we talked about the machinery of the nightmare. Let's really look at the mechanics of that.
Let's do it. Imagine you are asleep and trapped in a visceral, terrifying nightmare. A monster is chasing you through a dark forest.
Okay, I'm with you.
Now, ultimately, in terms of truth, too, we know that monster is completely empty of objective physical mass.
It's not a carbon-based life form.
Exactly. It's just a projection.
Yeah.
It's an emergent property of the empty flux of your sleeping mind.
Yeah.
It lacks inherent existence entirely.
Right. The monster isn't real.
But look at your physical body lying in the bed.
Right.
You are sweating through the sheets. Your heart rate is skyrocketing to 140 beats per minute.
Right. Your adrenal glands are flooding your entire nervous system with cortisol.
Your muscles are twitching.
Yep.
The physiological terror is conventionally functionally, undeniably real.
So the sweat on my forehead isn't an illusion.
No.
The cortisol in my veins isn't a philosophical abstraction, it's a biological fact.
Exactly. The empty flux generates intensely real relative experiences. The terror is real. The pain is real. The trauma is real.
Right.
But the cause of the terror, the inherently real independent monster you believe is hunting you, that never possessed any absolute solidity.
Ah, I see.
So when Nāgārjuna says the flux is empty, he is not gaslighting you. He is not trivializing your trauma or saying your pain doesn't matter.
He is saying the pain is being generated by your deeply ingrained belief in the solid reality of the monster.
Yes. The friction comes from believing the projection has mass.
Waking up from the nightmare doesn't mean you magically travel to a different universe where beds and sweat don't exist.
Right. It just means you realize the true nature of the flux you are already in.
And the physiological reaction, the sweat, the heart rate, it eventually settles down because the conceptual delusion, the belief in the monster's inherent reality, has been pierced.
Precisely. You are in the exact same bed, in the exact same room, but the suffering has ceased because the demand for solidity has been dropped.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because once my intellect accepts this, right? Once I sit with the nightmare analogy and realize, okay, the universe isn't made of solid dominoes. It's not a bunch of fixed nouns knocking into each other.
Right.
But my brain is relentless. It desperately tries to grab onto a new lifeline to avoid the free fall of emptiness.
It always does.
And that lifeline, especially for modern thinkers, is verbs. Oh, yes. The verb trap.
I read these chapters and I think, aha, I've solved it. If there are no fixed entities traveling through time, then reality isn't made of nouns at all. Everything is just a verb.
You think you found the loophole?
Yes. It's all action. It's all relationships and fluid processes. I essentially become a process philosopher.
This raises an important question, and it is perhaps the most seductive and prevalent trap in modern Western interpretations of Madhyamaka.
It is so common.
People read Nāgārjuna, they see him destroy nouns, and they think he's advocating for a universe of pure verbs. I am going to have to gently but very firmly shut that realization down.
Wait, really? Shut it down entirely?
Entirely. Relying on verbs or processes or relations as the new ultimate reality is a massive philosophical trap. It's a fundamental misreading of the text.
But we literally just spent 10 minutes using the metaphor of a flowing river. A river is a process. The current is an action.
Yes, conventionally.
Buckminster Fuller famously said, "I seem to be a verb." It feels so intuitively right when you drop the idea of a solid self. It is a highly useful conventional metaphor, yes. Yeah. It helps break the addiction to nouns.
Okay.
But if you take that conventional metaphor and try to elevate it to the absolute truth, if you say the universe is fundamentally made of processes, you fail the exact same logic test Nāgārjuna just used on the nouns.
Wait, how?
To understand the mechanics of why, we have to analyze the three spheres of action, which Nāgārjuna meticulously dissects. The trimatala.
The three spheres. Okay, let's look at how he sets that trap.
In any given moment of conscious experience or physical interaction, we conventionally, grammatically, divide reality into three parts.
Okay, what are they?
First, there is the acquirer or the agent. This is the noun, the self, the actor.
Got it.
Second, there is the acquisition or the action. This is the verb, the relationship, the process of doing.
The verb. Okay.
And third, there is the acquired or the object. These are the things being acted upon, the destination of the action.
Let's ground this with a real example. So if I am drinking a cup of hot coffee right now, I, the host, am the acquirer, the noun. The coffee in the mug is the acquired, the object noun.
Correct.
And the physical act of drinking, the swallowing, the tasting, the flow of liquid, that is the acquisition, the verb.
Precisely. Now, as veterans of this philosophy, you listening already know, we've used the tetralemma to prove that the nouns, the inherently existing self, and the inherently existing coffee are empty.
Right. They don't have a permanent independent core. They are dependently co-arisen aggregates.
Exactly. But your intellect is trying to perform a sleight of hand here.
Am I?
Yes, you were trying to say, well, okay, the nouns are empty illusions, but the verb, the action of drinking, the dynamic process itself, that must be the real underlying truth of the flux.
Right. I'm trying to say the network itself is the solid reality, even if the nodes in the network are empty. The action of drinking is the undeniable truth.
But Nāgārjuna proves that the action itself, the verb, is completely, inextricably, dependently co-arisen on the actor and the acted upon.
So they are tied together.
Inseparably. Try to imagine the sheer action of drinking existing out in the void of space, completely independent of a drinker and a liquid to be drunk.
Well, I can't. Without a mouth and a liquid, drinking is just a meaningless sequence of letters.
Exactly. You cannot have an inherently existing verb without inherently existing nouns.
Yeah.
An action only exists as a relationship between relata.
Between the nouns.
Yes. A process only exists as a transition between states. If the relata, the nouns, the states are proven to be empty of inherent existence, then the relationship, the verb, the process, must logically be completely empty too.
Wow. That is a total checkmate.
It really is.
I can't just pivot to Buckminster Fuller and say the universe is made of verbs,
Sure.
because a verb requires nouns to anchor its meaning and its function, and the nouns are empty.
Exactly right.
If I pull the rug out from under the nouns, the verbs fall right through the floor with them.
It is a devastating critique of process philosophy. The flux is not a universe of solid processes or inherently real actions buzzing around in the void, masquerading as ultimate reality.
The action itself slips right through the fingers of the tetralemma.
Exactly. The flux is thoroughly, comprehensively empty. Both the nouns and the verbs are dependently co-arisen conceptual illusions.
But they seem so real.
They appear, and they function beautifully in the conventional realm, but if you search for their absolute substance, you find nothing but more emptiness.
They are like an echo or a mirage.
An echo is a great example. An echo is audible, it functions, but it has no vocal cords of its own.
Okay, but let's pause and sit with the emotional gravity of this for a second.
It's heavy.
It is. Because if the flux isn't made of nouns, and it isn't made of verbs, I mean, if there are no solid entities and no solid processes, how do we intellectually grasp this without just falling into a dark, terrifying, nihilistic pit?
A lot of people do fall in.
Because honestly, my brain is struggling to find a floor right now. If there's no noun and no verb, what is there?
That feeling of groundlessness, that vertigo you're experiencing, is entirely by design.
Oh, good. So I'm supposed to feel like I'm falling.
Yes, it means the medicine is working. You're supposed to lose the floor. But we do have a framework to navigate this. Without falling into nihilistic despair, it's just not the kind of foundational floor you're used to.
Okay, what is it?
To survive this realization, we must profoundly understand the union of the two truths.
Ah, the U2T. Now, since we know you listening are advanced, we aren't going to spend time doing the basic truth one is conventional, truth two is ultimate kindergarten definitions.
We don't need to.
Right. We know that conventional truth, T1, is the realm of dependent origination. Traffic jams, medicine curing illness, gravity.
The everyday stuff.
And we know ultimate truth, T2, is the emptiness of svabhava, the lack of inherent essence and all those conventional things.
Exactly.
But what we need to unpack is the friction, or rather the lack of friction between them. The magic is in the word union.
Yes. The fundamental error even advanced students make is treating the two truths as if they are two different dimensions layered on top of each other, competing for supremacy.
Like they're fighting.
Right. They treat them as enemies. But they are not two realities. They are the exact same reality viewed from two relatively different epistemological perspectives.
The same reality.
Emptiness is not the destroyer of the conventional flux.
Mm-hmm.
It is not a cosmic erasure that wipes away your daily life. Emptiness is the very engine that allows the flux to flow.
That's a huge paradigm shift.
It changes everything.
Emptiness isn't the absence of reality, it's the prerequisite for it. Because if the flux weren't empty, I mean, if it actually had inherent permanent substance, it couldn't change.
It would be stuck.
It would be a frozen, immutable photograph. The hot coffee could never become cold. A seed could never become a tree because its inherent seedness would prevent it from changing form.
If things had inherent existence, causality would be impossible.
Wow.
Emptiness is the necessary breathing room of the cosmos. It is the spatial and temporal flexibility that allows dependent origination to occur at all.
I want to dive into the mechanics of this with an analogy from the traditional sources that really highlights how this union functions in real time.
It's one of my favorites.
Because it's one thing to say abstractly that there are no nouns moving through time, but it's another to try and picture what consequence or karma looks like without a solid noun anchoring it.
Right, we need a visual.
And that brings us to the famous analogy of the candle flame transferring from one wick to another.
It is a beautiful, incredibly precise, and ancient metaphor for the concept of santana, or continuity.
Right, let's look at the mechanics of santana. Imagine you have a lit candle in a dark room. You bring a second unlit candle right up to it.
Okay.
The heat from the first flame acts upon the vapor of the second wick, and the second candle ignites. Then the first candle is blown out.
Perfect setup.
Now let's look at this exact moment of transfer through the lens of the union of the two truths.
Let's do it.
Conventionally, T1, there is undeniable causal continuity. The first candle undeniably caused the second candle to burn.
Karma is real.
Actions have consequences. If you touch the second flame, it will burn your finger just like the first one would have. But ultimately, T2, if we search for the inherent essence of that transfer, no solid object called flameness detached itself from the first wick, flew through the air like a tiny glowing baseball, and landed on the second wick.
That is the union of the two truths in perfect functional action.
It really highlights it.
A localized continuum of heat and fuel allows for cause and effect, without any permanent soul or essence leaping between the wicks.
Nothing made the jump.
Consequence and karma are deeply, relatively real in the flux.
Yeah.
Your actions today will absolutely ignite the reality of your tomorrow.
Right.
But no fixed noun, no prominent identity is making the journey from today to tomorrow. The continuity functions, but neither the noun nor the verb has inherent reality.
It perfectly threads the needle.
It does.
It saves us from eternalism, the belief that a permanent soul travels through time. And it saves us from nihilism, the belief that since everything is empty, my actions don't matter.
Both are traps.
The heat transfers, the action matters, but no thing transferred.
But we must be incredibly careful here, because the human intellect loves to create hierarchies.
Oh, we always want a top dog.
It's an addiction. If we take this ultimate truth, this realization of emptiness, T2, and we start to elevate it to a superior absolute reality.
If we secretly decide that T2 is somehow more real or more profound than the messy conventional truth of T1?
Yes. If we do that, we have fallen into a very dangerous psychological trap. Nāgārjuna warns that this specific misunderstanding is like a venomous snake grasped ineptly by the tail.
Because if you grab a snake by the tail, it just whips around and bites you in the face. It kills you.
Yes. If you believe emptiness is a superior, pristine void that somehow transcends or destroys the conventional world, you fall into a profound philosophical disease.
Which is?
Apathy.
Ah.
You look at the suffering of the world, you look at poverty or systemic injustice, and you arrogantly say, well, ultimately it's all empty. It's all an illusion.
Oh, I've heard people talk like that.
Right. They say the victims are empty, the oppressors are empty, so why bother intervening? Why get my hands dirty?
That is grasping the snake ineptly.
Exactly. The union of the two truths demands that we deeply respect the functionality of the flux. It demands we respect the realness of the sweat in the nightmare, while simultaneously knowing its empty nature.
We can't just opt out.
We must engage the conventional reality vigorously without ever reifying it into an absolute.
Okay, so if the flux is this fluid, centerless web, and it's perfectly dynamically united by the two truths, why are we all so miserable?
That is the big question.
I mean, functionally, as a species. If reality is this open, flexible, empty dance, why is the human experience characterized by so much friction, anxiety, and suffering?
Because of a deeply ingrained cognitive mechanism called Madhyamaka.
Conceptual proliferation.
Yes, and our absolute fatal obsession with maps.
Mistaking the map for the territory. It's a classic mental model, but how does it specifically apply to this Madhyamaka framework?
Well, the human intellect survives by drawing rigid lines in a fluid world. We are, at our core, biological pattern recognition machines.
We have to categorize things.
We do. We look at the boundless, infinite flux. And to survive, to communicate, to build societies, we build conceptual maps.
Okay, give me an example.
We draw a conceptual circle around a recurring pattern of phenomena, and we label itself. We draw another circle and call it other.
Right.
We create incredibly complex, abstract concepts like success, justice, time, nation.
Even religious concepts.
Exactly. We even create sophisticated philosophical maps like the 12 links of dependent origination, or the very concept of emptiness itself.
And to be clear, we have to do this. I mean, if we didn't have maps, if we didn't draw those lines, we couldn't cross the street without getting hit by a car.
We couldn't function. We couldn't speak a language.
So the maps are fine on their own.
The maps are conventionally vital. The fatal flaw of humanity, the absolute root cause of our suffering, is taking these dependently co-arisen maps, which belong strictly to the tool set of conventional truth, and treating them as the absolute territory.
We believe the drawing is the real world.
We treat our concepts as if they are reality as it is.
It's like we are holding a paper map of a city, and we get thirsty.
Yeah.
So instead of using the map to navigate to the actual physical river, We put our face down on the paper and try to drink the blue ink line printed on the page.
And when the paper doesn't quench our thirst, when the map fails to provide the nourishment of reality, we suffer.
We just keep licking the paper and getting mad.
We experience profound existential angst. We get angry at the map. We get angry at the universe for not adhering to the map.
Right. We demand that the concepts we drew, our concept of how our career should go, how our partner should behave, who we fundamentally are, act like solid, unmoving reality.
And reality refuses to comply because it's a flux.
So if the map is just our concepts, our prapanyaka, what exactly is the territory? What is reality before we draw the frantic lines?
The territory is suchness. Tathat in Sanskrit.
Suchness. Reality as it is. It sounds almost poetic, but in this context, it's a rigorous philosophical term.
It is. It is the reality that exists before the mind slices it up into dualistic boxes of good and bad, self and other, existence and non-existence.
Before the categories.
Right. It is the primordial equality of all phenomena. It's dynamic, complete, and perfectly functional.
So it's not a blank void.
No. Suchness is simply the flux experienced directly, unmediated, without the suffocating, heavy layer of inherent existence that we constantly project onto it.
Okay, let me pause you there.
Sure.
Because whenever we start talking about the territory being undivided and experiencing reality before the mind slices it up into boxes, my modern spiritual conditioning immediately kicks in.
Oh.
I hear undivided reality and I immediately want to say, oh, I get it. I finally understand the ultimate truth.
What's the trap you're falling into?
If the territory isn't divided into separate boxes, that must mean everything is just one. Like a giant, unified cosmic consciousness.
There it is.
Right. The illusion is separation, and the reality is that we are all just drops in the single divine ocean of oneness.
And right there, with the best of intentions, you have just stepped into one of the most seductive, culturally pervasive, and dangerous traps in philosophy.
Ouch.
The trap of cosmic oneness, or monism. And Nāgārjuna completely dismantles this perspective using the generalized tetralemma.
Wait, oneness is a trap, but you hear that everywhere.
Everywhere.
It's the core of so much modern spirituality. It sounds incredibly profound and comforting.
It sounds profound and it is comforting, but philosophically, within the Madhyamaka framework, oneness is just a supersized ego.
Supersized ego?
It is a golden cage. Let's look at the mechanics of what you are actually doing when you claim everything is inherently one.
Okay, break it down.
You are taking the concept of inherent existence, the demand for a solid, independent, permanent noun, and instead of applying it to your small individual self, you are just applying it to the entire universe.
Oh.
You haven't abandoned the error of reification, you've just maximized its scale. You've created a massive, monolithic, inherently existent object.
Oh, wow. Okay, I see the sleight of hand I pulled. I didn't drop the map at all. I just erased all the small borders on the map, drew one giant circle around the perimeter of the paper, and called it the one. I'm still trying to drink the paper.
Exactly. And let's look at the functional consequences of monism.
What happens if it is just one?
If the flux is truly just a monolithic one, like a solid block of cosmic substance, similar to how some misinterpret the concept of Brahman and Advaita Vedanta, then diversity is fundamentally destroyed.
Right.
The beautiful functional mechanics of dependent origination are annihilated. Think about it. Cause and effect require relation.
They need a distance between them.
An action cannot produce a distinct reaction if there are no boundaries, even if those boundaries are just conventional.
Oh, I see.
If everything is just a featureless block of oneness, there's no separate coffee to drink, no separate friend to show compassion to, no cause and no effect. A completely unified block cannot act upon itself.
Because interaction requires at least some level of relative distinction. If my hand is completely fused to the hot stove, I can't pull it away.
Yes, exactly. This is why suchness, true reality as it is described using the generalized tetralemma to ward off these exact traps.
So how does the tetralemma frame suchness?
It is not many, because everything's interconnected and lacks isolated inherent existence.
Okay.
But crucially, it is not one, because diversity functions brilliantly, and dependent origination requires relative distinction.
Not many, not one.
It is not both, and it is not neither. It completely short-circuits and transcends all of our linguistic binaries.
So true liberation, the realization of suchness, It's not about finding a better, shinier map.
Definitely not.
It's not saying, oh, the rigid religious map didn't work for me, so I'll cling to the Buddhist map of emptiness, or I'll cling to the New Age map of oneness. It's not about clinging to any conceptual map at all.
True liberation is seeing entirely through the maps. It is recognizing them as conventional tools, using them skillfully to navigate the world, to communicate, to heal, but never ever believing they are the territory.
Okay, but how do we actually do that? Because this brings us to the ultimate pragmatic friction of this entire discussion. How does a person who has realized suchness, someone who sees the maps for exactly what they are, empty, dependently co-arisen constructs, how do they actually live on a random Tuesday morning?
That's the real test.
Do they just dissolve?
They live through a practice often paradoxically called acting without acting.
Acting without acting. It sounds like a riddle.
It does.
But based on our discussion of the two truths, you're saying the middle way is not a catatonic retreat from society. We aren't just sitting in a cave staring at a wall because everything is empty.
Not at all. A Buddha, or a highly advanced practitioner who has realized the flux, is deeply, intricately engaged in the conventional world.
So they're still in the mix.
Arguably more engaged than anyone else because they aren't hindered by the friction of their own ego.
Let's use a hyper-modern analogy for this, because the old chopping wood, carrying water cliché doesn't always land for people sitting in an office building.
Fair point.
Let's talk about a high-stakes environment. A trauma surgeon in an emergency room, or someone navigating a brutal corporate board meeting.
Perfect.
If I'm acting without acting, I still engage the conventional map entirely. I use my medical training, I read the vital signs, I execute the surgical protocol, I use the map of anatomy.
Right.
Or in the boardroom, I read the financial reports, I make the presentation. The difference is I don't generate the suffocating Prapanjaka narrative around the action.
Precisely. Let's look at the boardroom example. Before realizing the nature of the flux, you go into that hostile meeting and you spin a massive, heavy web of conceptual proliferation.
The story in my head.
You think, my boss is inherently evil. I am inherently a victim. If this presentation fails, my absolute identity as a successful person is destroyed. My life is ruined.
Oh yeah, I felt that.
You suffer immensely because you mistake the corporate map for absolute reality.
Yeah.
Your physiological system goes into nightmare mode.
Sweating through my suit.
Exactly.
But after realizing suchness, I still walk into the room, I still give the presentation, I advocate for my project, but I'm entirely unentangled.
You just do the work.
I feel the tension in the room, I convey the information, I use the conventional map of corporate structure, but I don't build a fortress of absolute identity around the outcome.
Because there's no inherent identity to defend.
If the presentation fails, the project fails, but I am not destroyed because there was no inherent I to destroy in the first place.
You are fully engaged in the flux, but you are not violently resisting it or aggressively clinging to it. You act, you respond to the conditions of the moment without apprehending the action as an absolute defining metric of your soul.
You are fluid.
You are fluid.
Okay, but this brings me to the absolute climax of this whole deep dive.
Let's hear it.
The biggest pushback I hear regarding this philosophy, and frankly the pushback I feel in my own chest when I read this.
It's natural to feel resistance.
If justice and morality are ultimately just maps, if the suffering of the world, the systemic oppression, the violence is ultimately empty of inherent existence, doesn't this philosophy inevitably lead to detached, privileged apathy?
This is a huge concern for people.
Like, if the world is an empty illusion, why fight for a better world? Why advocate for the marginalized? If it's all just the flux, why not just sit on a cushion and let the world burn?
This is perhaps the most crucial distinction we can make in this entire exploration. To answer that, we have to understand the profound functional difference between attached activism and spontaneous compassion.
Let's break down the mechanics of both. Start with attached activism, because I think that's what most of us are familiar with.
Attached activism is fueled by rigid, reified dualities. It relies on the map being absolutely real.
Okay.
The internal narrative is, I am the inherently good savior. You are the inherently evil oppressor. We are fighting an absolute cosmic war of good versus evil.
Very black and white.
It is fueled by anger, by ego, and by a desperate, often unconscious need to solidify an identity as a righteous person.
And we see that everywhere. We feel it everywhere. And frankly, it leads to massive burnout.
Completely.
Because you are trying to fight the poison of the world using the poison of your own anger and clinging. You are trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
Exactly. It might achieve short-term conventional goals, and conventionally, those goals might be vital and necessary.
We still want to stop the harm.
Yes, but psychologically and structurally, it perpetuates the underlying cycle of grasping, hostility, and suffering. It reinforces the very illusion of separateness that creates oppression in the first place.
So what's the alternative?
Spontaneous compassion, on the other hand, operates on an entirely different mechanism.
How does that work?
When a practitioner truly realizes the flux, when the delusion of a separate, isolated, inherent self is completely destroyed, compassion arises naturally.
It's not forced.
No, it isn't a moral obligation. It's a structural inevitability.
Spontaneously. Like a biological system rather than a philosophical choice.
Yes. Think of the analogy of your physical body's immune system, or simply your body's pain response.
Okay.
When you accidentally slice your hand with a kitchen knife, your white blood cells don't convene a philosophical debate about whether the hand deserves to be healed.
Right. They don't check a rule book.
Your right hand doesn't look at your bleeding left hand and say, well, I am a righteous right hand, and I have a moral imperative to save the inferior left hand.
It doesn't demand a moral commandment to act. It just acts.
It rushes to the wound because the left hand and the right hand are recognized as intimately interconnected parts of the same system.
Oh, I love that.
When you deeply realize that the absolute boundary between self and other is just a conceptual map, an empty, dependently co-arisen illusion, you realize that you and the suffering person in front of you are nodes in the exact same limitless, centerless web.
So their suffering is your suffering.
You act to alleviate their suffering, not to earn karmic moral points, not because a religious rulebook told you to, and not to build an identity as a savior.
You just heal the system.
You act as the natural, unobstructed, spontaneous response of a mind that has realized suchness.
You don't need a moral commandment to pull your hand off a hot stove. You just pull it off.
Exactly.
Because the system recognizes the damage. So an awakened mind in the flux heals the suffering of others because the rigid artificial boundary separating my pain from your pain has been proven empty.
Yes.
It's almost like attached activism is an autoimmune disease, where the body's map is so confused it attacks itself, whereas spontaneous compassion is the healthy system functioning perfectly.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. This is exactly why the Buddha's teachings and Nāgārjuna's rigorous deconstructions were never meant to establish a new, dominant philosophical map for intellectuals to argue over in universities.
They aren't just debate topics.
The teachings are a surgical tool. They are designed out of supreme spontaneous compassion to extract the poisoned arrow of our rigid views.
They are meant to heal us.
They use concepts to point beyond concepts. They use the map to show you how to look up from the paper and finally see the territory.
So what does this all mean for us?
It changes everything.
We started this deep dive looking for the jagged white line on the X-ray. We wanted a clean, binary answer to the universe. We wanted to know exactly what the flux is, made of solid nouns or flowing verbs.
And what did we find?
What Nāgārjuna shows us is that the flux is this beautiful, terrifying, centerless web of reality that defies all of our conceptual boxes.
Defies all of them.
It is the rushing river, and nirvana, true freedom, isn't finding a magical way to freeze the river into ice cubes or finding a second river.
No second river.
It is simply the profound, total cessation of our demand for the flux to be solid.
It is the willingness to set down the heavy, exhausting, reified maps we have been carrying our entire lives, to stop drinking the blue ink, and to finally, truly look at the inconceivable territory of suchness.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the listener, as you step away from this deep dive and back into the current of your daily life.
Something to ponder.
We've talked extensively about the 12 links, about causality and the grand philosophical maps of the universe. But think about the most intimate, tightly held map you possess.
Your own identity.
Yes. The narrative of your own identity, the story you tell yourself about your past traumas, your future anxieties, your limitations, and who you fundamentally are.
We all hold on to it so tightly.
If all of that, every single defining characteristic you cling to, is just a map drawn onto the fluid, centerless flux, who's the you that will wake up tomorrow morning?
If you are not inherently trapped by the rigid lines you drew yesterday, what is possible?
What kind of world will you choose to draw next when you step back into the river? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. It is a profound, paradigm-shattering shift in perspective. Keep questioning your maps and finally, take a look at the territory.